Welcome to today's workshop. And I'm assuming since you made it on Zoom, you know how to use Zoom, but just a little refresher, if you have questions, I'm going to try and remember to ask throughout. I actually have a lot of images for you because I tried to pack as much introductory information in here as I could, but hopefully we'll get through all of it. But if not, please know that I will share the slides with you all, and you can type some questions in the chat. We'll ask Ben to moderate them. All right. So one of the first types of, I want to say questions that I really start to think about, especially now that I've been beekeeping for a while, is not so much, just bees as they are insects, but who are they as an organism, and that's their role on this earth, where they're from and how that plays into that role. And then who are we as their keepers, and even our own, upbringing and cultural and traditional perspectives, and how does that relay into our management or to our stewardship of bees. So I'm going to play this little 3-minute video here of sort of my story here.
I've traveled many a bumpy road in the darkest of nights, serving as a chauffeur to beings of sweet starlight. I migrate with them, like a shepherd, roaming with my flock of winged midwives, as a fellow follower of the bloom, a self-proclaimed nectar nomad. I was introduced to this artistic science of beekeeping 2 decades ago, as a U.S. Peace Corps volunteer collaborating with peasant farmers in South America. The bees captivated my curious mind, and working in an outdoor office made of fresh air, flowers, and freedom enticed my soul. My nomadic journey as an apiculturist has taken me far from where I could ever have imagined, having come from a humble home in Pueblo Indian country in New Mexico. My heritage is a mosaic of cellular memories influenced by my Native American ancestors, who instilled in me a profound reverence for place and purpose, and to pursue acts of community service. So I chose to become a bee farmer, as I wanted to continue to learn from Mother Nature and Father Time. As a farmer, I share beekeepers' voices of concern and need for adaptation and innovation to fulfill our dedication for local to global food production. Sharing their challenges, I became encouraged to return to academia to help quantify their observations and advocate for pollinator conservation. Now, as a researcher, my quest to better understand the relationship between cultures, food systems, and stewardship is at the forefront of my thoughts. Honeybees are like some of us and our ancestors, immigrants to this country. They have adapted and become the backbone of agriculture. There are distinct ecotypes or subspecies of honeybees, like races in humans, and these ecotypes carry genetic histories like seas, which contain their very existence and memories of creation. For within each one, they have the power to nurture and adapt, and the magnificence to create life, food, and medicine for the world. One of the things I most enjoy about beekeeping is that it bridges cultures and goes beyond borders. It connects us to our origins as fellow beings of light, as a part of this land, not separate from it. This magnificence is alluring and inspires me to find and connect with bees and their keepers around the globe. I invite you all to accompany me on my nectar nomad storytelling journey as I chase the bloom, encounter cultures, and follow the liquid starlight known as honey from flora to flavor to feast.
I like to play that to the end because my mom did the music, and so she plays the flute. She's a wind rider, and yeah, I mean, I could go on and on about all these different experiences I have, but I think really what it's just allowed me to do is to recognize that there's a lot of differences between different places and different cultures and different bees, but also there's a lot of similarities, right? And in how we approach them. So let me do share screen again. Talking a little bit about, I call it beeography or buzzing around the globe, the different types of bees. There's over 4,000 known species of bees here in North America, and there's over 20,000 globally. So that we know of, right? And so there's a lot, but honeybees in particular have become sort of the poster child, and they've also become rather exploited. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that and ways to sort of mitigate that. But I definitely credit honeybees with introducing me to the broader world of pollinator bee species. And I'll talk to you a little bit too about our native honeybees here in the Americas, because we actually do have a native honeybee, at least a fossil remnant of one. So let me see. Well, there we go. So just for kind of the sciencey aspect of it here and talking about it in some of the Western scientific terms, but I applaud Samuel for wanting to work on getting it into other languages. I think that's super important. But they are in the phylum of Arthropoda, which just means segmented legs. And insecta means 6 legs. So whereas spiders have 8 legs, that's arachnids, insects have 6 legs. And so for bees in particular, they're what you call hymenoptera, which means split wings. And then they're in the superfamily Apoidea. So this here is just kind of showing all these different families of different kinds of bees and their relationship to them, at least to each other, at least from a Western perspective. And so some of them are what we call solitary or eusocial, meaning they live in smaller groups, and then some are what we call social, which would be like honeybees. So within Apidae, there's a few of them, and one of their main characteristics is that they rely on pollen and nectar for food, but they have hair, they have fuzz. Okay. So I'll just kind of go through a few different kinds here. This is an Andrenidae, which is a mining bee, a solitary ground nesting bee. There's actually over 2,000 species of them, and they're actually very small. And I took this picture in Taos, right off of SDS Road at a friend's place where I have some bees. And so that's a tiny little bee on her poppy flowers. So they can range in size from really small to very large. There's Collectidae, and these are cellophane or plaster mast fork-tongued bees. So they actually like to collect mud, or will drill into the sides of irrigation ditches. Halictidae, or green sweat bees, you might see some of those around. They're very iridescent. And all of these bees do have stingers, but they very rarely sting, mostly just for defense if they feel threatened. Megachilidae, which is leafcutter bees. And they love to actually also collect pollens off of our cacti and stuff. So I usually tend to see them on those. And you can tell they all look very similar. Like they look, oh, that's a bee, right? But they are distinct. And these ones in particular are solitary. They don't actually live in a group. Melitidae, this one's actually found strictly in Africa, so we don't have them here, but you can see they have a lot of hair. This one's actually found mostly or only in Australia. So this is Stenotrididae, and they almost look more like a wasp, right? A little bit more glossy, but they still do have some fuzz. So Apidae within bees, or within honeybees, we have these cavity nesting ones, which are Apis mellifera. And then we also have Apis cerana, which is, Sarah was probably got an introduction to those when she was in China. There's also Apis dorsata. These are mega apis or giant bees, and Apis florea or micro apis bees. So there's a whole bunch of different ones, but I'm going to talk to you, of course, about Apis mellifera. So there's a really cool scientific paper that came out in 2012 that's about different migration theories. And so, we tend to think that honeybees are exotic and that they were brought at least to the Americas by settlers, right, by colonizers. But as I mentioned, we do have our own native honeybee. It's a fossil remnant that was found in Nevada that's 14 million years old. That's called Apis mellifera nearctica. So I like to consider our modern day honeybees that we have here as being relatives or cousins to our fossil honeybee that we had here native to the Americas. And so just like horses, they were here, and then there was an ice age event, and then they disappeared, but then they've been reintroduced. And in fact, just weird side note, but I think it's an interesting one. Horses, when they were here pre-contact, so to speak, they were actually the size of small dogs or house cats, right? So interestingly, as time goes on and as things evolve, but there's a school of thought, especially from Ojibwe, that the horses, the reason there's such a deep connection with some Native American communities with horses is because they've known about each other before, that it, it wasn't just after contact, right? And so that I really kind of feel that one of our connections to bees, or at least my connection to bee, goes back, from before I was born. It's a known relationship. And so I invite people to when you get into beekeeping, to not only have them as whether they're pets or as livestock, but to really cultivate a relationship with these organisms, because they are quite fascinating, but also they really can teach us more about the world and also our connection to the world. So just kind of looking at these different migration theories and what they call, quote unquote, the old world, right? Some of these different, versions show that they originated in Africa, or they originated in the Middle East, but then as they spread out, whether it was due to mountain ranges or bodies of water, that kind of shaped the way they migrated as well. And as they migrated, these little pockets of them became really adapted to certain locations. And so that's what we call subspecies. So they're all honeybee species. They're in that one species group. They can mate with each other, but they're distinct subspecies. So I describe it like races in humans, right? We're all human, but we have different races of human. And so same with the bees. And there's actually close to 30 recognized subspecies of honeybees. And so they have a third name, the trinoma apis means bee, and then mellifera means honey, so honeybee, and then ligustica would indicate more their regionality. In this case, for ligustica, that's actually referring to Italy. So what some people will call Italian bees, right? And a known subset were brought over, as settlers came over to Turtle Island or to North America. They brought bees with them. They brought seeds, they brought other animals, they brought all sorts of things that they, thought they would need to use or, want to have with them. And it was a pretty long journey. So not, a lot of these bees didn't make it, and not all of the different kinds were brought. But as bees became adapting to the new landscape here, they started to proliferate on their own. And so then importations kind of slowed down. And then the advent of steamships rose. And so a new influx of bees from Egypt were even brought over, and from other countries that were even farther away, because transportation became easier. But then in the 1920s, they shut the borders because of something called the Isle of Wight disease, which is actually also referred to as tracheal mites. And so it's microscopic mites that we can't see, but they were killing off bees in the UK. And so they actually shut the borders, and that law still exists today. So technically, nobody's really allowed to bring in honeybees from other places. They did open the borders briefly around 2005-06 to bring in a bunch of bees from Australia. And then colony collapse disorder hit the news, and so they shut the border again. Not to say that that's where that came from, but they just, panicked and they just shut the borders again. And so I'm giving you this history because you'll see where I'm going with it. If bees are from different places and they've really developed and locally acclimated to specific spots, but then what we have here, we move around, and it doesn't necessarily have that adaptation. It really does play a role in what we have here and how are we able to steward them positively. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. So yeah, a few of them were brought over. And then here's just sort of a little rundown. The dates correspond to, of known records of when bees were brought. And it's just by continent, not so much specific countries. The last one is Russian, which actually is not a subspecies. They're actually a cross or a mix. But I put them here because they were brought in 1997. In the 80s is when another mite really sort of came onto the scene called Varroa mite or Varroa destructor. And so it's like a tick that actually, for 30 years, actually, they've been thinking that these Varroa mites were sucking the hemolymph or the blood off of the bees. But Dr. Samuel Ramsey, who's a very prominent newer researcher on the scene, he's also an African-American bee researcher, which is really awesome because we're getting some more diversity within the broader research industry for apiculture. He actually found through his undergraduate work that the mites are actually sucking on the fat bodies of the bees. So that shattered like 30 years, 3 decades worth of research into it. But when these mites initially came on the scene in the 80s, people started to panic and they started to, use chemical warfare against this this quote unquote bad bug, right? Which ticks are actually 8-legged, so they're in the arachnid family. They're more related to spiders than they are insects, but they still are an arthropod, segmented legs. And so anytime you try and put chemicals to kill something that's considered bad on something that's considered good, it's going to have a negative effect on the good one, right? So in the late 90s, the USDA bee lab in Baton Rouge decided to import in some Russian bee stock. And since they couldn't bring bees in because of that law, right, in the 20s, they were able to bring in the semen. And so they bring in germplasm. And so through a process of instrumental insemination with insects, which is, might blow some people's minds, but it does happen, as a tool, it can be used to then back cross, and they can get to about 97% of the original stock line. And the hope was that they were bringing in bees, or at least bee stock or genetics that had already co-evolved with this mite, and then they would be able to share those genetics. So Washington State University, where I just finished my graduate work, is another pretty awesome bee lab, and they do a lot of bee breeding work. And my advisor actually travels the world, and he brings in semen. And his perspective on it, not to put words in his mouth, but is that we have these issues, we have these pests and these pathogens, yet bees in the old world had time to adapt and co-evolve with them. But because we shut the borders and we don't have these local adaptations yet here in the States, we're losing bees. What can we do to sort of mitigate that? And so by bringing in this germplasm, same thing, he's able to back cross. They inseminate virgin queens that are of other stock lines, and then their daughters and their sons get collected, and it gets back crossed, so that then once they have near the original stock, then they can breed that out and naturally mate with other queens, and then share those with producers and beekeepers to help broaden that genetic pool. Because ours has become slightly narrowed since they stopped importations. And also we've had, industrialized agriculture. It's also impacted industrialized beekeeping. And so you have very few large-scale producers who are responsible for producing 80% of our nation's bees, and they're breeding the same stuff over and over and over again. So American bees have become slightly inbred, so to speak. So some of these programs are to sort of help combat that, but to help reopen the genetic pool of our bees here. And in 2015, they brought in Apis mellifera pulmonella. Pulmonella is referring to apples. Kazakhstan has a really, up in the mountains, they grow a lot of apples. And so this Apis mellifera pulmonella is actually really locally adapted to that apple cycle. So that's that sort of little history on bees and bee genetics. And so now I'm going to switch over to biological cycles, but also just the seasonal cycle of bees. So I call this flying together with the superorganism. So honeybee anatomy. Within honeybee colonies, we have 3 distinct kinds of bees. We have one male version, right, which is a drone that's at the very top. And one of the ways you can tell it's a male is because you can barely see it, but they have really fuzzy bums. They also have ginormous eyes, and they look really big. They look menacing because they're big, but they don't even have a stinger. So go figure that. But the reason they're so big is because they have to fly at a distance to go and mate. So they have to be able to store a lot of energy. They need really big, strong muscles for their wings. So their thorax is really big. And that's the drone. And the drones are actually, this is not the scientifically correct term, but this is a metaphor for it. They are clones of their mothers. The drones come from unfertilized eggs, so they only have their mother's genetic information. So when you have a colony that you really like, yes, wanting to get daughters off of them is one way, but you really want their sons or their drones to be the ones that are out mating, because they're the ones who are passing along their mother's direct genetic information. And then you have the queen, who's in the middle. She's the only sort of verified reproductive female. The worker underneath is also female, and she can lay eggs, but because she's never mated, all of her eggs will become drones because they're unfertilized. And so that doesn't really leave for a viable colony. They will, when push comes to shove, lay eggs if they feel like they can't they've lost a queen and they're not able to replace one, but they usually end up dwindling and dying in that case. But the queen is, she's herself also female, and between the queen and the worker, they have two sets of chromosomes. So they have their mother's information and they have their father, the drone's information. And so they are what we call diploid, whereas the drone is called haploid, which means single. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. This is a really cool video, hoping it'll play here for you, of just bee development that Nat Geo put together. The stomach's egg, then they hatch to a grub. And they're eating royal jelly and growing. And the little holes on the side are their spiracles, so that's where they're breathing. And then they'll undergo pupation, just like a caterpillar would. And they'll undergo metamorphosis. That varroa mite when they're crawling around. Those are what we call the mushroom bodies in the brain. So that's their brain and consciousness forming. It's pretty cool. And then they're emerging and they're eating, feeding each other. That's called trophallaxis. And that's that. So that was really fast, but it shows the first 21 days of a female worker bee and how she develops.
That was so cool, and the music was amazing too.
Oh, I know, right? Let me see if I can turn the slide here. It's not one. There we go.
Melanie, if you wouldn't mind sending a link of that video, we have one request for that link.
Sure. I definitely can. So when you look at that, I mean, that was really fast, right? But they go from this little egg to a grub, just like a caterpillar would, and then they will actually spin a small cocoon. That one had, the cell sliced open so that we could see it, but it gets covered over by wax, and then they'll spin a cocoon in there, and that's when they'll do their pupation. And then when they emerge as an adult bee, they have all these interesting parts, right? They have their segmented legs. They actually have something called the corbicula right back here, which is where they collect pollen. It's like their pollen bags. They have what you call their tarsals and metatarsals. They're their little toes, actually. They have a lot of fuzz that helps to collect the pollen. Their spiracles, these are their breathing holes right here. And so their heart is actually in their tail. And then their thorax is mostly filled with the muscles that they need for their wings in order to fly. And then they actually have their main eyes here, their compound eyes, but they have these three little ones up on top called the ocelli, which I think is just so cute. But they're for helping to determine light. And so as we talk a little bit about how they function, all of these different parts of their anatomy, right, work together to then allow them to do the awesome magic that they do. So they also see very differently, talking about, eyes. And so I'm going to share this with you because I'm going to talk a little bit about habitat and flowers too. This is actually another video, but it's pretty short, just showing how we see flowers and then how bees see flowers. So let's see if it'll play.
Welcome to It's Okay to Be Smart. I'm Dr. Joe Hansen. For bees and flower blossoms, springtime is all about two things: feeding and fertilizing. See, the flowers want to pass their genes on to the next generation, and the bees need to eat so that they can do the same. So they use a little teamwork. But how do bees find flowers? And how do flowers find bees? What does a bee see when they see one of these? For millions of years, plants have evolved to depend on insects and other pollinators to carry their genes on to the next generation. And flowers are like a big neon sign. They used to say, "Land here." In return for getting a helping hand in making baby plants, most flowers offer up a tasty treat in the form of nectar. It's like a dinner date, only you eat afterwards. Biologists call this type of arrangement mutualism. The flower gets to spread its genes, and the worker bee gets a sugary drink and packs her knees with golden, protein-rich pollen to take back to the thousands of hungry mouths back at the hive. Everybody gets what they want. See, flowers sure look pretty to us, but bees see them in a completely different light, literally. Not only do they see the world through these compound eyes made of thousands of individual pixels, they see a world bathed in ultraviolet, way beyond what our eyes can see. We see this, and they see this. See, special pigments absorb the UV light, and they paint this big bullseye in the center of the flower, guiding the bee to the tasty nectar, and of course that sweet, sweet pollination. Now, the relationship between flowers and bees goes way beyond the visual. Scientists from the University of Bristol recently discovered that bees can sense a flower's electric field. Just like when you run across a carpet in your socks, bees build up a positive charge as they buzz through the air, and flowers are slightly negative. This helps pollen jump from the flower onto the bee like electric Velcro. And it also helps the bee figure out if another worker has already visited that flower and slurped up all the sweet goodness. Now, nobody knows quite how the bees sense that electric charge, but their fuzzy little bodies might be buzzing like your hair when you rub a balloon across it. Now, evolution's been playing matchmaker between bees and flowers for millions of years, resulting in one of nature's closest relationships. So next time you see a bee buzzing around the garden on a warm spring afternoon, imagine how their world looks, and think about how much of nature remains invisible unless you see it through the right pair of eyes.
Cool. Oh, I wasn't planning on playing the whole video, but it almost did. How do I change? There we go. So yeah, that's a little taster on, how bees see, right? And so I share this with you because as you, not only have bees, but hopefully want to be able to nurture good habitat for them, you'll keep that in mind with your planting of flowers. As it is all about flower power, which I'm going to talk about here in a minute. So now talking about, we looked at their anatomy, right? And now we're going to talk about this functionality and this process of pollination. So we already went through the three different castes, or the three different kinds of bees. There's only two different castes. And what it is, a caste means that there's a differentiation within one gender. So we have two females in the hive, right? But one's a queen and one's a worker. So those are the two different castes within the female gender. And then you have the drone or the male bee. So here's some of their development time. And we saw that video of a worker bee where it said the first 21 days, right? But each one develops differently. So everybody's an egg for the first 3 days of their life, right? And then they hatch, and then they're fed royal jelly, which I'll talk a little bit about later too. And royal jelly I equate it to kind of like describing breast milk. It's their first food. It's super nutritious. It's chock full of vitamins and amino acids and all those good, healthy things. And then after the third day, their diet changes to what you call bee bread, which is a mix of pollen and honey, except for the queen. She is the only one who's continually fed royal jelly. And that is what makes her a reproductive female. And it also allows her to live for a lot longer than workers and drones. Workers will live about 4 to 6 weeks in the warm season because they literally will work themselves to death. And during the cold season, when they're not foraging a lot, they can actually live several months. Males, on the other hand, will live until they mate, and then they actually die right after mating. So if they don't mate, then they can sometimes make it through winter, but a lot of times their sisters will kick them out to save on resources because they're actually not out foraging at all. They're just hanging out waiting to mate. So the workers are the ones who do all the work, hence the name. But this kind of shows when they turn into a pupa, and then when they become an adult and when they emerge. And so because the queen is fed royal jelly, takes her only 16 days or about 15 and a half days before she emerges from egg to an adult virgin queen. Then she has to go and do her mating flights, which actually can take about a week depending on the weather. She'll only mate during that one period, and she'll mate with multiple drones. And so then the semen gets mixed up in what you call her spermatheca, and that will last her whole life. She won't go out to mate again. And so once she runs out of sperm, then she will only be able to lay unfertilized eggs. So, in nature, back in the day, queens would last 5, 8, even 10 years. And now, which I'll talk a little bit why this is an issue, a lot of queens are being replaced every 6 months. And so a lot of that has to do with nutrition and loss of habitat. So plant more flowers, people, to help build that habitat. Okay, so I call this next section that it takes two to tango. So this plant pollinator choreography, because how they make the royal jelly and how they make the bee bread is all about what that little video that we just saw about the mutualistic behavior between flowers and bees. And so flower design and chemistry and the pollination process and mechanics. So this is kind of just going over an overview a little bit of plants and looking at, what we call vascular plants and non-vascular plants. They're the first gymnosperms and angiosperms. And, when dinosaurs were roaming the earth, it was a lot of ferns and things like that. And then when flowering plants developed, that's when we started to see more insect pollinators. So they co-evolved together. They're, why would a flower produce beautiful smelling, perfume and nectars and pollens if it didn't necessarily have to, right? Or didn't want to, whichever way you want to look at it. And so I find this relationship really, really interesting. And this is just kind of showing how you can tell the difference between the two, right? So if they're non-vascular, if they're vascular seedless, or if they're a gymnosperm, which are like pines, and evergreens, or then if they're a flowering tree, which is an angiosperm. So there's different types of pollination, which I'm sure a lot of this is kind of rudimentary and elementary, but I like to go over it just to sort of lead into the next section. But looking at, whether it's self-pollinated, so plants that have both the stigma and their anthers on the same flower can self-pollinate, and others need cross-pollination, right? Where pollen from one has to go to the other. And the way that this can happen is either through wind pollination, which a lot of wind pollinated plants can still also be insect pollinated, but they don't rely on the insect to do it. So like, pine and bristlecone and stuff. Or then you have insect pollinated plants, so cross pollination, where they're, the bees are actually collecting the pollen as their protein. And then the nectar is their carbohydrate. And together that makes their complete diet. And so in return for them not only getting those nutrients, they're helping the plants to reproduce by providing pollination, right? And so a lot of these characteristics of insect pollinated flowers tend to be that they're brightly colored. They also smell really good, right? A lot of times I get emails from people that are like, oh, the bees are all over my apples, but not my pears. And I always say, go smell the pear flower, and it smells like fish. So it's like, no wonder. But, if nothing else is blooming, then the insects will find it. So talk about timing, right? So you should find the pears that bloom at a different time than the apples, so they don't compete for insect visits. So pollen is actually very special. It's very what I want to call geometrically designed. There's all different shapes of pollen and all different kinds of colors. And a lot of it has very different nutritional values too. So depending on what plant it comes from, and this makes sense, right? I mean, we have herbal medicines, or we have particular culinary herbs that we use, and they all have a different scent, a different flavor. They bring something different to the table. And so the same goes with the pollen from these plants. So as the bees are collecting them, they're also able to self-medicate and collect what they need from what's available. So if we're in, say, monocrop agriculture, where there's not a lot of diversity or a lot of different pollens to choose from, that's like, as a metaphor, I would describe it as us only eating, say, Wonder Bread, right? If we only ate one kind of food, our nutrition would really be poor, and then our immune system would be compromised. So same with these insects. If they, we want them to be healthy, they have to have diversified nutrition. So this kind of shows the flow over the year. And this is just a little graph map, but it depends on where you're located, right? If you're down in the southern states where it's really warm, or say in southern New Mexico, your spring is going to really start, even in February. Whereas up on the mountain and up in Taos, like our spring, because we get late frosts and late snows, that really doesn't, this curve would move to the right about, couple months, right? So depending on your elevation and depending on your topography, where you're located, whether you're, sea level or in a canyon or alpine setting, all of this is going to change slightly. And it's really important to learn your area plant index and to become familiar when your nectar flows are, because a lot of times people get antsy. They see the first flower, oh, I want bees. But the bees also need that initial bloom in order to want to do their own biological cycles and to want to reproduce, which I'll talk a little bit about coming up here shortly. And so, when we see those blooms, there's something going around now, which is pretty cool, called No Mow May. I don't know if you guys have seen it. There's a hashtag No Mow May, and it's trying to encourage people to not cut the dandelions, to leave the dandelions, because one man's weed is another bee's honey, is how I describe it. And so you need, these insects need that initial food to just even get going, to get that protein, because they've been in a dearth all winter, right? And so we'll talk about how they, one of the reasons they store their honey is in order for them to eat that and consume it during the months when there are no flowers. And then that starts to run out. So they really need that initial bloom. So I just love this picture of these pollen grains on this bee, and how cool they are. Pollen is super, I'm really fascinated by it because it has all those interesting shapes. The lighter pollen, at least weight-wise, can be blown, right? So that's more wind-borne pollen. But some of these ones that are real sticky or have like sort of look kind of punk rock with spikes, it's so that they can really get, stuck on these pollinator hairs, and then that way they can be transferred into the cycles of life. So now we're getting to the nitty gritty. That was all background info, right? But now I'm actually going to talk to you about, okay, let's talk about beekeeping. Like, how does that affect me as somebody who wants to keep bees? So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this following the bloom, and I talked about that seasonal cycle, but that seasonal cycle is actually going to determine what your role is or what actions you need to take at particular times of the year. And then how do you navigate that, right? So, Mother Nature and Father Time provide a lot of ecosystem services here, and pollination is, I hope you can see it here, it's but one of these many services, whether it's supporting, provisioning, cultural, or even regulatory, right? From the water cycle to air to thermodynamics, all of that is a part of ecosystem services, and pollination is right there with it. So for us here in New Mexico, right? I mean, we all know where we're at, right? We're right over here, but where the desert and the plains meet the Rocky Mountains. We have everything from desert to tundra here. I think our lowest elevational point is like 2,900 feet. And of course, our highest point is, close to 14,000. So we have a lot of diversity. We're also the, fifth largest state by area. But of course, population-wise, it's pretty low. And that's because it's all about water. And we all know how critical water here is in the West, New Mexico for sure, right? Because we're just a very arid state, and water is a blessing and a curse. We need it, but then sometimes when we get it, it's torrential. Like we had these hailstorms just last weekend. And of course, my mind went to, don't knock the blossoms off, because if it's too big a hail or too fast and furious, there goes that forage, right? And so even though it's still spring, those blooms aren't available, and it's going to take several weeks for the next cycle of blooms to appear. And so as a beekeeper, I have to go, okay, do my bees have enough food, or do I need to, one, move them somewhere else where they can get the food they need, or two, bring the food to them, just like you would a horse or a goat. There's only so much pasture. And if it runs out, then you have to bring them alfalfa, right? Or you have to go take them to where there's alfalfa. So the same actually holds true for bees, especially when you choose, and I'll get out my soapbox here in a minute, but when you choose to have bees in your area, when you take on that responsibility, right? If bees swarm in and move into a cottonwood tree at the end of your block or neighborhood, they're living in a tree, they're what we call feral, they're wild. We're not going to necessarily need to or be able to go in there and manage them. But when I say I'm going to get boxes and I want bees here in my space, then I have a responsibility to them to provide what they need and to make sure that they don't get sick. So talking a little bit more about our diversity here in our desert to tundra landscape. And so I like to show this just even within our growing zones, how different we are from north to south and even east to west. And so time and seasons really do play a very significant role. I like to show this shot up here because it's actually the Jemez Mountains and there's snow on there, but look, there's fruit bloom. And that's a little bit lower elevation. And so we tend to get these late frosts, right? Or that cold air sinks. And so a lot of times, spring is exciting, but I've learned to curb my enthusiasm because I always know there's going to be a late frost. And so I tend to, take it slowly at the spring because I just never know, is it going to be a boom or is it going to be a bust? Especially here where we are at elevation, because that's a very precarious point in time for us and for our bees. So we have our broader ecosystems, earth, water, air, and the various organisms. And so depending on where they're located, it's really gonna determine what type of forage is around. So I'm going to be talking more about the agroecosystem, or looking at spaces where we have agriculture and communities sort of living side by side, but we also have very urban, and we also have very wild lands. So if you're a city beekeeper, say like based in Albuquerque, you are going to have a lot more ornamentals, which can provide a lot of bloom, but you're also maybe potentially going to have a lot more people who are using pesticides and stuff because it's readily available, right? Whereas the farther away you get from quote unquote human society, the less impact you're going to have from mankind. And so not to say that that's a more pure site, because we're still all sharing the same air and the same water. And I mean, even when we had our farm up in Truchas, now it's in Gatito, but when we had it in Truchas, they were finding traces of, contaminants from Los Alamos that were blowing all the way over there. You would think that, that must be a really safe spot, but no place really on the planet is safe, really, from human impact. So I kind of walk this line between, my ideals, what I would really like to have, and then of course what our reality is, and really trying to find that compromise. On the left here, these are pictures up top of favelas in Rio de Janeiro. And of course, there's no compromise there, right? But then on the bottom right, you see, large scale agriculture, a lot of it's monocrop agriculture. That's also not a compromise. And so we have to try and find these varying landscapes in between where we can have some wildlands and some, cultivated lands, or some, urban settings, but also have some public lands where our bees have access. And we really are what we eat. And of course, we eat what sustains us. And so, up until the 17th century, botany and medicine went hand in hand, but then they were separated. And we started to really dissect Western science, and the Western perspective really started to dissect and isolate things. And unfortunately, that really created a disconnect, not only in how we view our food and food system, but also in how we view our health as well. And so this pharmacy is actually an Egyptian word, which means the art of making magic. And so I like to share this because, the 70% of known cures come from plants. And so there really is a connection between not only plants as our relatives, but also as these beings that provide us with sustenance and that provide us with medicine. And we're not the only ones that they provide for, right? They provide for all these other wildlife and other organisms. And the knowledge of these healing power of plants became a real special calling and a source of power. People who curanderas and medicine men and women, and people who really paid attention to what plant medicines could offer. And I think that we're at a point where we're recognizing, a lot of our processed foods and what have you are really taking us away from this innate and special knowledge. But I share this because not just are humans these special, beings that recognize this, but our bees, they know this. They know that plants and flowers are medicine. So it really does all come down to flower power, and being able to nurture more flowers and a diversity of flowers, right? Because we talked about nutrition and how bees and pollinators need diverse nutrition. So this here, this is actually a little schematic from when I was in Peace Corps when I first got started, but it really does show really well. You've got the weather, you've got how that's impacting the plants, and then that creates a nectar flow. And so there's actually a ton of nectar out there, but not all of it gets actually turned into what we call the honey flow, right? And so the bees will collect what they can when it's available, and then pass it from sister to sister. It'll get mixed with enzymes, and it gets stored and then fanned, and then will turn into honey. So nectar is very watery. You'll learn this as you're keeping your own bees. When you first see a bunch of nectar in the comb, it'll drip out and it's really watery. and it can ferment. And so the bees know that they need to fan it and dehydrate it to about under 17% water content in order for that to then become honey that's pure and raw and that will never go bad. So there's even honey in the Egyptian tombs that's 3,000 years old that has never gone bad. And bacteria can't live in it because it's just full of plant sugars. Sucrose, which is glucose and fructose. So I already showed this slide, but just trying to bring it back home to like how it really is all about time and seasons. And so if you're in the desert or if you're in the city or if you're up in the mountain, you know, it's land or death, really. I love that sign that's right there, going on the way to Chamentira Maria. But really focusing in on what is the seasonality. So learning more about your own plant index and the timing of it is really going to determine not only how you can manage your bees, but whether or not they can survive, right? And so I consider myself a seed saver of sorts, where the bees are the seeds. And so really trying to find those strains that have developed local adaptation and regional adaptation, and then really try and nurture those and propagate them to share. So this is talking, you know, just a little bit more about pollen, but also how it's an exchange for life and how it, as a protein, and in a sense, it's, you know, it's carrying on the life of plants, but it's also carrying on the life of bees. And so as seeds, you know, even we are kinds of seeds, our stories are really formed over thousands upon thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years. And seeds remember, you know, and so the bees remember, whether we want to call it instinct or it's just innate or just genetics, you know, it all creates this story that can unfold and that is shaped by its environment. And so if we alter that environment, right, or if we alter this pollen in some way, what is that going to do? So this is just a little bit of food for thought to think about, you know, when this interconnectedness, because sometimes people will think, oh, well, you know, I'll get bees, I'll put them in a box, nature will provide. But the truth is that as humans, we've really kind of screwed up the landscape. And so, you know, this is really, it's not a reality anymore to expect bees to just survive in every place by themselves. Some can and will, and that's great. And we need to promote that. But for when we want to bring bees in, we need to make sure that, you know, they do have what they need. So not to get all doom and gloom, but I do feel an obligation to be realistic with you all. You know, there's some obstacles. We've got, you know, more drought conditions coming. We've got changing climate, wildfires, all sorts of things, you know, less water, contaminated water. And all of these are going to have an effect on what grows or what doesn't grow. And plants are very intelligent. You know, if it's a stressful year, they're not going to be pumping out as much nectar or pollen. And what they do pump out will not necessarily be of the highest quality. And so there's some really cool research that came out recently from Italy showing that even when plants start to bloom earlier, all the insects that have co-evolved to be in sync with that, if they're not on the same timeline anymore, then it becomes out of sync. And so we're going to have some collapsing of various relationships because of changing climate. And so I think it's something that we all really need to learn more about and figure out, you know, how can we mitigate, how can we adapt, but also how can we regenerate our landscape so that we can try and keep as much biodiversity as possible. So all of these things I mentioned will affect the bees, right? So how does it affect them? It affects their microbial populations, even within their gut. Their gut microbiota will be affected. Even when we use antibiotics on them, even for humans, right? So we're all organic beings. And so it, you know, even though we're distinct species, and I don't want to anthropomorphize too much, there are some parallels that can happen. And so when we have these disruptions in our nutrition, when bees have these disruptions in their nutrition, they become more susceptible to illnesses. They will not live as long. They'll lose their queens or will have loss of genetics, and they'll start to really dwindle. So this is just a cool slide. This is borrowed from Dr. Diana Samataro. She's now retired. She used to be at the Carl B. Hayden Bee Lab in Arizona. And I always mention her because one of my very first beekeeping books, it's called The Beekeeper's Handbook, which I highly recommend. And she co-wrote that. And it takes you through the whole year of beekeeping. but, you know, bees are collecting, I talked about the medicines they're collecting from plants, right? So they're collecting within the nectar, there's various elements within the nectar that allow it to transform. And then they're mixing it with enzymes, right? And so there's this whole this chemical reaction that's happening that allows it to become medicinal. And so when we start, you know, this is a picture of a feedlot in California. So they're feeding the bees a lot of sugar water or even high fructose corn syrup, which we all know how good high fructose corn syrup is, right? It's not good for us and it's not good for bees, especially if that's the only thing you have, right? I mean, push comes to shove, especially with some of these beekeepers who have a lot of bees, you know, they're trying to make their dollar stretch. It's very expensive. And so sometimes, you know, that it becomes more of a cost factor. But I really see it as, you know, we've got all these different sort of whammies coming in all directions, and nutrition really underlies a lot of it. And so if your bees, you know, with the varroa mites in particular, people have been really nervous about them. And it's not so much the mite itself, it's the fact that they're vectoring viruses. So even if you have one mite in your hive, there's a chance of virus. But if your bee's immune system is well developed, if it's healthy, if they have good genetics, then there's a chance that they can survive that, right? And overcome it, or at least cope with it. So I really see it as like, there's going to be viruses, even ourselves, we're walking bags of bacteria, right? But our immune system keeps all of that sort of icky stuff away so that we're seemingly healthy and functioning, you know, humanoids. And so the same with bees, if their immune system is up, then it can keep a lot of these various contaminants. And imagine that you're flying through the air, you're landing on different flowers, you know, all of these things can have contaminants on them. So it's really important to keep their health up. And I really follow a path of biomimicry, or at least I try to. You know, Mother Nature has really developed a lot of these things over, you know, millennia, and we haven't even been here for, you know, we're the youngest of all these various animal creatures. So I feel like there's a lot more that we humanoids need to learn. But in general, you know, if we can emulate the natural processes and nurture those, I think we and our bees have a longer and a more successful chance of surviving. So again, I'm going to get off my soapbox, but I really do think it's, you know, our interconnectedness to each other, to our landscapes, to our bees, and to our bees to the flowers, and flowers to the habitat. You know, it's all really interconnected. And so the more we can really be observant, and that's what I really like about my role now as an extension educator with the Institute of American Indian Arts, is really taking that, what we call TEK, the traditional ecological knowledge, and pairing it with Western sustainable agriculture science where appropriate, right? So it's, you know we can't go back in time, but if we can pair the two knowledge systems, or multiple knowledge systems together, or unity of knowledge, one of my favorite words is consilience, which means unity of knowledge, and really get a more holistic approach to how we not only steward our landscapes, but also, become more mindful beekeepers. So yeah, I like this picture here too. This is, I actually made this slide probably 10 years ago as something that I was kind of hoping would happen in the future. And now it's really happening. There's actually several beekeepers who are working with solar companies because they have all these solar arrays out, and now they're also putting in pollinator forage. And so there's a way to also connect, the past to the present and to the future, and be contemporary in that we're harnessing the power of the sun, right, through these solar panels, but we're also providing food for insects, which are ancient beings, right? And so there's a way to kind of pair our technologies together. So it really does take a community to raise bees, and sharing that education between farmers, researchers, institutions, and networking. For myself, with my farm partner, in our location up on the high road to Taos, in our small little farm, I mean, we are not big by choice and by circumstance. New Mexico is not known for honey production. We just don't have huge valleys, and we don't have a lot of water. So it can be hit and miss. And what I found, at least within my own beekeeping here in northern New Mexico, is that if I leave my bees in one spot, sometimes the rains won't come at the right time, and then I end up having to feed them more. And I would much prefer to spend the fossil fuels to take them to different pastures in order to ensure that they have the nutrition they need. And in a sense, I'm sharing them with various communities, which helps with pollination. I'm also getting to test them in different environments so that, for me, in terms of as being a breeder and wanting to select these seeds, these naturally resilient seeds, like I get several sort of, I want to say, positives out of moving my bees to different places. And I don't move all my hives all the time. I really just try and follow the flows, but I will move them when I have to. Right. And I will feed them when I have to on occasion too. And kind of going back to that biomimicry aspect, I make a tea out of various like herbal teas. I use chamomile, spearmint, lemongrass predominantly, and to try and make it like nectar. Right. I mean, I can't ever make nectar or replace it. But say we have a drought everywhere, then, what am I going to do? I can't take them anywhere. It's dry everywhere. So then I will offer them food. So some of the current trends going on, we've got a lot of more urban beekeepers happening now. The New Mexico Beekeepers Association actually has a bee certification course. They have bee certification level 1 and bee certification level 2. And I serve on the board. And so I've been talking with a few community partners to see if we can develop and expand that program to also be up here in northern New Mexico, because right now they're based in Albuquerque. But we'll see where that all leads. There's also a variety of hive styles, and I'm going to show you the next slide. I'm hoping I can get through this all because I want to leave some time for questions. I know we're starting to run out, but there's a lot of different hive styles that are available. And so, kind of broadening that narrative, but, it's kind of like, we all end up using the one thing, right? Everybody goes for the Big Mac, and but there's actually so many different kinds of burgers. Or I actually like to equate it more to like potatoes, right? We only see a few different ones in the store, but there's actually over 200 different kinds of varieties of potatoes. And so the same with beehives and bee abodes. And not all of them are suited for certain climates. Some people, want to try certain one because it looks really snazzy, but then come to find out, well, that might work where it's like, warmer or, bigger rainy season or what have you. And so a lot of it can be trial and error, but joining the area clubs and networks can really help. And I think a lot of it also comes down to starting with the right kinds of bees. And that's why I started this whole presentation off with the different kinds of genetics of bees, because if you didn't know that there were different kinds, you wouldn't know. You would think, oh, there's just honeybees, but there's actually a lot of different kinds. And some of them are better suited for warm weather, some of them for cold weather, some of them are better suited for low elevation and high elevation. So there's, do your research when you start looking into getting bees if you don't have them already. And then your bees are going to be mating with all different kinds of drones from what's around. And so knowing who in your community has bees, I mean, obviously I don't know as a beekeeper, but I try to participate in the various groups and really be open to communication so that we can support each other. And there's various opportunities, whether you want to be small scale or large scale. Here in New Mexico, it is pretty hard to be large scale. We don't have very many large scale beekeepers just because of our landscape. But there's a lot of people now doing what we call sidelining, which is it's sort of like a hobby that has advanced to the point where, they still have other jobs, but they're doing a lot with it, going to farmers markets on the weekends and stuff. And so I think we're at a point in time, before it used to be kind of go big or go home, but now we have a lot of small scale beekeepers, and that's really awesome because it's good to have a lot spread out versus just a few that are really large, right? So this is just showing some urban beekeeping efforts, and they use a van, to just drive their bees around. And this is actually in San Rafael, California, where they can only have 2 hives in their backyard. So they collaborated with, it's actually Skywalker Ranch, to be able to use that space and have more hives there. Here's a few these are what I call case studies, and these are people who are working on locally adapted stock lines. So whether you're on the West Coast or in the Intermountain region or the Heartland or even on the East Coast, and this is not a comprehensive list, but these are just some of the people that I consider to be collaborators and mentors. So yeah, takes everybody. It takes our Department of Agriculture, it takes our institutions, it takes USDA, You know, it takes various organizations, TCEDC, I should have put your logo in here, as to, you know, really show that we can, you know, work as a community, and kind of driving it home with this consilience and linking different principles together, but different disciplines to really create a more holistic and mindful approach to pollinator stewardship and to beekeeping. So some of the benefits, right? I mean, I talked about honeybees being the poster child, but also being exploited. And they really have opened my eyes to the broader world of just bees in general that I shared with you at the beginning. And so all of these pollinators need our support, you know, from the bumbles to the little sweat bees that I talked about, the iridescent ones. They all need space and good nutrition. So yeah, some of the things you can do: produce a variety of crops, try not to spray, and to provide a habitat for all of them. And it really does revolve around community between botany and medicine, kind of bringing those back together, how that relates to nutrition and food, and how it impacts healthy organisms, and then that will lead to healthy products. So I would leave it here, but I want to show you just a few more slides, and then we'll try and do some questions here. I'll try and save the last like 10 minutes for questions, but it really is imperative that we you know, research and implement some sustainable management practices. So this is a very dated photo because that little kid there is now, she is 12. So she's as tall as me now, but that was when she was real little, my daughter. So, and just talking a little bit about navigating the seasonal compass, I'm trying to see, I still have a bunch to show you guys, but I will try and just go through this briefly. We already talked about the different kinds of bees. The most predominant ones that we have for honeybees are Italian, Caucasian, New World Carniolan, Russian, and you'll hear even like Saskatraz. You'll start hearing all these different kinds of bees, and just really do your research and ask the right questions, which are like, where were the bees raised? What were they fed? Were they medicated? What were they medicated with? When were they medicated? Don't be afraid to ask those questions from producers, because you know, they should be forthright and transparent about how they're rearing their bees. We talked about time and seasons. I talked about the calendar. So this is just kind of reiterating that whole timeline and the nectar flow. And what I want to do is I'm going to go fast here because I want to get to the very end. And I'll mention this briefly when you're talking, you know, natural beekeeping or organic beekeeping does not mean hands-off beekeeping. A lot of times that's what you call a bee haver, not a beekeeper. And you don't want to be that person who brings bees in and then doesn't pay attention to them, and then they start spreading diseases and affecting the other bees in the area. So in order to be really mindful, you know, it's almost like you have to do more hands-on and just be aware of what your bees are doing. And to, you know, my farm partner considers it like a game of chess. You have to think of all the what ifs and all the different moves you would make. Like, if my bees get sick, what am I going to do? You know, am I going to isolate them? Am I going to medicate them? If I medicate them, what am I going to medicate them with? Is it going to contaminate the honey? There's a lot of things, and we'll go over this if you stick with me and come to our next session. We'll really kind of go more in depth onto the how-tos of all this sort of stuff in organic reality. So let me skip ahead here because, okay, we'll talk a little bit about products from the hive, which probably most of you have heard of. Honey, right? Has over 21 essential amino acids. You can get different kinds. It has its own terroir, so to speak, just like wine, depending on the soil and the area foraged. So when I harvest from the valley, it's very different, you know, than what I'm going to get in the mountain, and at different times of the year too. Wax can also be harvested, and it's actually the sweat of the bees, and they need over 20 pounds of nectar just to sweat out 1 pound of wax. So it's their biggest asset, and it takes a lot of energy. So you can imagine if we get late frost or we don't get rain at the right time, they're not going to be able to make the wax, which is going to store the honey, right? Or they're going to use all their energy to make wax, and then there's no more forage for them to store anything. And so sometimes you may have to feed. I always encourage people to feed initially, because that will immediately get converted into energy for creating their comb, and then they can forage for all the natural stuff and store that and actually survive off of the natural stuff. Pollen and propolis are also other products and are highly medicinal as well. And we talked a little bit about royal jelly. which some cultures are really advanced in their knowledge and in their management and sort of value-added products. But these are all avenues that people can look to develop. And then even what's called apitherapy, or using hive products for health and wellness, whether it's stings for multiple sclerosis and arthritis, or other ailments as well. And so food is medicine, people. I think the last thing I wanted to show you was just a little bit about some of the equipment, so that then you can become familiar. I know we're running really close on time. I wanted to save 10 minutes for questions, but now I'm going over. But I just want to show you here, look how many housing options there are. This is just like one screenshot. There are so many different kinds. And the main thing I like to tell people is make sure whatever you get is user-friendly and that you can standardize yourself. Sometimes people get 5 different kinds and then they can't borrow from Peter to help Paul because nothing fits, nothing matches. So you want to try and just set yourself up for success, and also to be, as supportive of your bees as you can, because sometimes you do have to borrow from Peter to help Paul. I'm talking about hives, right? In case one's a little bit weaker, one's a little bit stronger. And throughout history, they've been, whether they were in clay tubes or logs or baskets, and now even woodenware, they've got a few different options. So I'm going to flash forward here. Let me do stop share so I don't make people dizzy. But I'm just going to show you one video of handling bees that I filmed not too long ago, actually, up at the farm. And when we do the next session, I'll finish showing kind of all this stuff. But if you go online, you can click bee equipment, and you'll see all sorts of stuff come up. There's a lot of different options. Okay, let me do screen share again really quick, just to show this quick video. It's like just a few seconds long. And just showing you at least how from current slide. So this is actually up in Vidito, and I filmed this, actually I filmed this last summer. And when I talk about bees not being all the same, some of them can be more aggressive than others. Mine are pretty gentle, so I'm just wearing a sundress out there. But I always tell people, be comfortable. I first started off pulling it up with gloves and everything, and I was working with really aggressive strains in South America, so we had to. But now that I know that there's different kinds of bees and they have different temperaments, you find what works well for you. And you also want to be safe. No matter where you're at, you want to be safe. So I'm pulling out each room, use a little bit of smoke to mask the pheromones. And then we're able to go in and look. And what I'm mostly looking for is I'm trying to find the queen, but I'm also checking the brood pattern and seeing, are they healthy? Do I see anything funky or anything amiss? Do they have enough food? Not every time are you going to find the queen, but you want to, you see evidence of her, make sure that they have eggs to ensure that they're doing all right and that there's not anything else you need. When you use a vertical system like this has become my preference because I can add and remove things as needed. And this brown capping that you see, those are actually the babies. So underneath they're developing, they're going under pupation, right? And these are all the worker bees or the sisters. And I think I show a drone here later, but when you come out to the farm for part 2, you'll get to see this. There's a male one. You'll get to see it. So there we go. Let me get out of that. Can't see anybody yet. I'm sorry. Let me try to find you all. Where are you? Okay, I'm here. And I did leave at least 5 minutes for questions. I'm so sorry it wasn't longer. But you can tell I tried to give you a bunch of information, and hopefully it whet your appetite for wanting to learn more. And I, kind of to talk a little bit about northern New Mexico beekeeping, we definitely learned the hard and expensive way of how to do things. I kept bees in other places before I even kept bees here in my home area. And so at least I knew how to handle bees, but I didn't know what the flows were. And it took several seasons to try and figure that out, and then to really sort of create like a pattern, or at least a sort of, okay, at this time of year, I'm going to do this. And then at this time of year, I'm going to do that. And so a lot of times it's just the bees and nature become your real teachers when it comes to beekeeping.
Amazing. Melanie, we're so grateful to you. Honestly, that was such a fun workshop. So glad to have you. And yeah, we can hand it right over to the participants here. If you want to unmute, feel free to ask any questions.
You know, I really approach varroa mites and dealing with them mainly through genetic selection and then through nutrition, because I know there's always going to be mites. But if I can keep my bees' immune system healthy, then hopefully they'll be able to deal with any viruses that those mites are vectoring, right? So starting off with hygienic, but also, you know, varroa resistant stock can really help. Doesn't mean you're not ever going to see varroa. It just means hopefully that those bees know how to cope with it. And for testing, a lot of people will do what they call mite counts. Usually early on in the year, you're not going to see very many varroa mites because the population is low. But as the population increases, then your varroa mite levels increase. And that's because the varroa mites are also doing their whole biological life cycle inside the honeycomb cells. They're, you know, feeding off of those fat bodies, right? So that's why you saw in that one video, you saw them crawl around real quick, and they can do some damage in there. So they, you know, they reproduce underneath the cells. So a lot of times when you see mites on bees crawling around, those are what we call phoretic. They're just on the outside, but it doesn't indicate how many are underneath the cells with the baby bees that are pupating. You know, it used to be like if you had anywhere between 7 and 10 varroa mites, and what it is, you take a sample of about 300 bees or a quarter cup of bees, you can put them in a jar of powdered sugar with a screen top and shake it. Then they get coated with it. You can open the screen, the bees fly off, but then those mites are in the powdered sugar, and then you can dissolve it in water and see how many mites you have. You can also do an alcohol wash, which then sacrifices those bees, but again, about a quarter cup of bees is about 300 bee sample, and then put alcohol, or some people use like window washing fluid on it, which kills the bees quickly. But then you can, you know, shake it and then pour the dead bees out, or actually pour the liquid out and the mites are floating in it. And it used to be that anywhere between, you know, 7 and 10 was, you know, kind of the threshold, but over, I want to say even just the past 5 years now, when people even see 3 mites, when they're doing counts, they start to think about what are they going to do for mitigating that. You can use screen bottom boards. You can do what's called the Dowda method. We've done that for off and on over the years, but it's been a while. And it's basically using powdered sugar again to just sprinkle over the brood nests of your colony, whether that's in 1 box or 2 boxes. And as they clean each other up, then they're cleaning the mites off, and the mites will fall through the screen bottom board. But you know, mites can travel as well, and bees can be reinfested. So what I've learned is that those who are like in urban settings where there's a lot of urban beekeepers, if not everybody's on the same schedule, and so you could kind of clean your bees up, but then they'll immediately get reinfested because, you know, not everybody's on that schedule. So, you know, the more isolated you are, it's a little bit easier to manage. There's a lot of soft organic treatments out there. I'm not overly familiar with a lot of them, but there are some. Main thing to keep in mind is just, of course, following the label, you know, because if you apply it at the wrong time of year, it could hurt your bees or hurt the queen or the brood, and it could also contaminate the honey, right? Which, even if you left it for them, means that they're going to be feeding off of that. But there's a product called Hop Guard, which is a really soft one. It's made out of hops. It's got beta acids in it. There's also thymol based applications or therapies. There's even formic acid ones, which I know if it's really high heat, you have to be careful because it can kind of burn the bees. I mean, it's an acid, right? So putting acid on bees. And there's oxalic acid, which oxalic actually, I think, is found in like rutabagas or something. So it's, you know, naturally based. But anytime you kind of use something to hurt the bad bug, you're also going to harm the good bug. So my approach really is through genetic selection and just making sure the nutrition is up. If I have bees that are really infested, then I try and move them to another location because I don't want it to, spread issues or anything else. But a lot of times I will requeen if that happens, just try and get some additional, strong genetics in there. And then there's some hardcore stuff that works really well, but it's toxic. So I try to avoid that stuff myself. My farm partner makes something called Smite, which is it's his own version of like an essential oil mix. But again, when if you're not sure what you're doing, find stuff that's already sort of, made by people who know what they're doing, because you don't want to be a kitchen chemist and, burn yourself or hurt your bees. So for testing, so early on, you're not going to see a lot of mites, but I would test definitely, starting by late June and then again in July and then again in August. And you'll see the numbers go up and then you'll see them maybe go down. But by August, if the counts are really high, do something, because you got to kind of get those mite counts down before they go into fall and winter.
Yeah, there were two things I know a lot of people were curious about. The first was the varroa mites, and the second was beekeeping at high elevations. I think one
right.
over at 7,500.
Yeah, so if you're doing a horizontal system like top bar hives, one of the things I've learned is to make some additional ventilation ports, because when the bees cluster up in the winter, when we get those cold nights, they don't get as much airflow in a horizontal system. I mean, the law of thermodynamics is that heat rises, right? And so I even put ventilation ports on my upper boxes to help with that. But if you're in a horizontal system, they could choke out, like they're respirating through winter. CO2 is rising in their little, abode. And that's actually, it's kind of a good thing, but if it becomes too much, then it's obviously can kill them, right? Like as CO2 rises, they start to go into like slow mo, what we call torpor, where they're kind of just, they're not hibernating, but they're not very active, but they're slowly rotating around and eating what they've stored, their honey stores. And so if they don't get enough airflow, then the CO2 could get too high and then they just asphyxiate. And that's because they're too cold to move air, right? So even for, vertical systems, I like to put upper ports. And one of the reasons I like that too in the vertical system is because when they come home with their groceries, right, after foraging, they don't have to come in the bottom and go up how many flights of stairs. They can just fly straight into the pantry top and kind of store their stuff. So I'm a big fan of making sure there's enough ventilation. You don't want too much, like I talked about screen bottom boards, like you can use those during the warm season, but I would close them off in the cold season because then we get too drafty and too arid. Oh, good. Oh, it's a lion's hive. Yeah, those are cool. Those are kind of like more like a little trunk hive. You may find you need to add a super to it, because bees will, as long as there's space, they're going to keep building. And for this next workshop, we'll talk a little bit more about, when to add space, when to minimize space, how to add supers, and how to even do reversals and things like that. But with your lands, I think, having, think about it, bees do like to live in trees, when there are trees. We don't have a lot of trees here in New Mexico, but we have some. And the bark is really thick, and that adds a lot of insulation. And so when we look at our commercial hives that you buy, they're not very thick. And we get really hot and we get really cold. We have all 4 seasons in one day, even in the summer. So what we used to actually put ours back to back and side to side and even wrap them in roofing paper and all this stuff. But our solar gain during the day, even in winter, really, I had bees coming out in 17 degrees and then they'd fly and flop on the snow and then they couldn't get back because they chilled. So what we decided to do is, instead of wrapping everything, we just put a piece of insulation on the top. And so I use anywhere from 1/4 inch to 2 inch thick, like insulation sheets. And I'll put that on the top, and I'll usually put another piece of wood so, it doesn't weather too much and start deteriorating from the UV light. But that's kind of how I deal with it. And if you are able to put, wind breaks, because we do get a lot of winds here. So having some sort of windbreak, even if you can surround them with straw bales or a trom wall or something, can also really help. But ventilation, cold will not kill your bees. Lack of ventilation will, because even as they're respirating in there, it's condensating on the inside and then it can rain back on them. and they could even drown in winter. So that's why those upper ventilation ports can really help. And they'll seal them with a little bit of propolis if it's too big. You know, I use a 3/4 inch drill bit, and that way I can even plug a cork, a wine cork, which is my excuse for having a glass of wine. Or you can tape it over or stuff it with newspaper, or what have you, if you need to move your bees. But always put those ports on the same side as your entrance, because you still want to be able to stand, you know, somewhere around your hive and not be blocking their flight path. Well, that's a great question. And I mean, I feel like it's one of those areas that I'm still learning more about. But I'm fascinated with plants, and especially with what we have here in our desert, plains, mountains, you know, little cluster here. And so Plants of the Southwest is a really good nursery. They have a base here in Santa Fe and in Albuquerque, but they have a wonderful online guide that talks about all these different plants that grow at elevation. Depending on how much water you have, I mean, if your bees can be near some type of field with whether it's alfalfa or clover or, you know, but in general, what I found, you know, is that early season, we're going to have the mustards, right? We're going to have the start of, we have locusts, we have globe mallow, we have willows even, and then even our cottonwoods as well. Depending, I mean, if you're a riparian zone, you'll have a little bit more water. You'll even have maybe Russian olives, which are invasive, but you know, I've actually only seen bees on them when there's nothing else, but the nectar smells like candy. And then as we get into the summer, you know, it does start to get drier in some places. And that's one of the reasons why I've moved my bees. So I'll start them in the valley in the spring, but then once it gets warm enough on the mountain, I take them up the mountain, because summer is really lush on the mountain. It's a shorter season, but it's that's where there's more water. And so then they, you know, can get wildflowers and sweet clover. And then we'll start to get the sunflowers, right? And then normally we also get asters and chamisa going into the fall, especially if we get rains at the right time. So, you know, in terms of what can you plant, I mean, we're lucky that they're winged because they can fly up to 5 miles to forage. But the closer the food source, the more energy they can actually bring home to their family, right? So you want to try and ensure that they have enough forage within a 1/2 mile to 2.5 miles. But I know that sometimes that's hard depending on if we don't get rain at the right time. If you're, say, on the East Mesa, you know, or out in TP, you know, honeybees may not actually be a very good match for that environment, because there's a lot of sage, but it actually doesn't provide nectar, you know, and it doesn't flower until October, you know, and so then they can get some pollen, but they may actually be really struggling to find nectar. So, you know, there are some locations where other bee species might be a better match. They won't produce honey, but, you know, they still serve their purpose and are just as beautiful. So it just kind of depends. I mean, but I would look up Plants of the Southwest and see what really they recommend depending on what your landscape is. I think the more you're able to interact with other beekeepers and find local mentors, and my hope is that we can actually set up a good Northern New Mexico beekeeping network. I know that there was one for a while, and then the gentleman who was running it passed away, and I know that there's still some people who are kind of meeting, but it's really you know, kind of just on the fly. And so hopefully we can make something a little bit more organized and be able to support each other's efforts. But yeah, check out nmbeekeepers.org. I'll type it in the chat. That's the state association. And there's also, I didn't get a chance to show it, but there's also I'll type it in here, Western Apicultural Society. They do a lot of really cool work for the Western region. They've been having free monthly lectures online. And they usually have an annual conference. And then there's also the American Beekeeping Federation, which is really cool. I mean, a lot of times people go, "Oh, that's for, you know, I'm just barely getting," and seeing all these other people all across the country and even all across the world who are just fascinated with bugs and bees in particular, and can kind of geek out and really just share with each other, learn different techniques and approaches, and hear about all these different things, and to be able to share your own story too. So
I did want to take a moment just to say this workshop was made possible through a grant that we have right now at TCDC, and something else we provide is free mentoring to farmers and ranchers to help find funding for their agriculture endeavors. So feel free to reach out. I left my information there as well, and I'm happy to leave a few minutes still if anyone has last questions. And obviously, just such a big thanks to Melanie at Queenbees for joining us today. If you're watching this online later, let us know on social that you did. That would mean a lot. And yeah, that's all we have. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody.